Hey everyone, welcome back to Build with Katherine, where I share practical ways to design and build products using AI. Today, we're going to be talking about Cursor and design systems, and specifically how I personally use Cursor to turn design systems into real working products. If you're a product designer working with AI, this channel is for you, so feel free to subscribe. I'm trying to put out more content like this as I come up with new ideas. And please feel free, if you have any comments or other things that you have questions about or want to discuss, you can send me a message on LinkedIn. My name is Katherine Chaliff, or leave a comment here. So let's get started. So design systems are at the core of how we work these days as product designers, right? And Cursor is becoming more and more part of our workflow, one of the other tools that we have in our toolkit. So how do we put these two things together? How do we go from these beautiful Figma files that we spend tons of time maintaining, syncing with our developers? How do we bring that into Cursor when our work increasingly isn't even happening inside Figma anymore? And we're starting instead from a window like this in Claude Code or Cursor or anything. So a bit more about me. I mentioned a bit about myself already. My name is Katherine Chaliff. I'm a product designer. I've been working in UX for over 4 years, primarily in business to business and complex systems products. Recently finished my master's degree in human computer interaction at Reichman University. And while I was studying there, I won an AI product sprint competition with Wix and Base44. I feel really fortunate to so recently have had this opportunity to focus on developing my skills, as the work we do as product designers has changed so much. A couple of years ago, our titles were different, and now the tools that we work with are starting to change. I think it's changing our profession in a way I find really exciting, and that's why I really want to share with you guys what I've learned, and also learn from you guys. If you've found ways to work with these tools that I'm not covering here, I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to talk. So please reach out on LinkedIn, get in touch. I'm excited to hear from you guys. So before I get into it, I want to give you a bit of initial framing on perspective that I'm coming from in all of this. So this presentation is mainly made for non-developers who work in product teams. Of course, fellow designers, you are my main focus, but also PMs and other people whose main job maybe isn't development, but also is touching product. This could be very relevant for different goals in terms of what you're trying to do. In Cursor, the maturity of your product need different approaches. So there's not one right way to work with AI or even a right tool. Like today we're talking about Cursor because that's where a lot of this work is happening. But you also could, almost everything I say is applicable to any of the other agentic coding tools that you can do. It just depends on what your specific goals are in a specific moment. So if you've never used Cursor before, I really recommend you check out my intro video. I'm going to link it here so that you can get to it easily, where I talk about just how to set up your first project. In this video, I'm going to speak assuming that you already know the basics of Cursor. But if you need a refresher, definitely reference this video. Another note, so our examples are going to be websites built with HTML and CSS just to keep things simple. If you want, you can build something another way with a different tech stack. If you're working with some other specific kind of tech stack and want help, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to explore and make a follow-up video. So now let's talk about different use cases for Cursor for product designers. So in most cases, what Cursor is being used for is as an ideation tool or a prototyping tool. Cursor is a way that helps us explore ideas or to demonstrate a design when we're passing it to front-end developers. In some cases, and I think as the tools are getting better, this might be more of the cases, it can touch production code, like code that will actually ship in the product. But I don't think it's the right mindset to think of that as the default when we're using Cursor. Like primarily, it's another way of representing our ideas in the same way that the prototypes we make in Figma are, that are removed from what we're actually shipping to our customers. So the first way to use Cursor would be doing a low or at least lower effort prototyping. So Example of this would be, so again, my background is in B2B SaaS complex systems. So probably the ideas that I'm thinking about here, I'm sure that for those of you who work in more B2C stuff or just have like a different industry background, you might think of other use cases, but this is what kind of comes to mind for me. So this would be like if I have data that I need to show on a table that maybe can have different kinds of filters applied, and I want to see how that works in an interactive way as I make those kinds of design decisions. How I want to display search results or have like a filtering or sorting logic or a ranking logic within the app. It can be really powerful for if you have sample data from somewhere to actually be able to simulate that in a way that wouldn't be possible by just dragging and dropping in prototype mode in Figma. So the procedure for doing this, you can upload the data and some screenshots from the existing design system and ask Cursor to render a basic UI for you or simulate interaction behavior. So this procedure that I just described of uploading the screenshot and data, prompting with the existing behavior, and then of course testing and iterating after that. This method is really best for when you want to use real data. Otherwise, it's probably more appropriate to just use Figma Make. So the main benefit of this approach is that there's very low setup effort. You can get started immediately. It's not like you need to do an entire design system migration to get something that looks very close to what you're actually using in the rest of your app. So this is great for when Figma and Figma Make prototypes are just too limited, when you need to simulate real logic and behavior with complex data. But this isn't necessarily going to produce production ready code or pixel perfect design on the first try. And that might not even be your goal if the main thing that you're trying to explore is UX decisions that aren't necessarily dependent on the specifics of the UI being exactly correct. It can also be really useful, I didn't write it in the slide, but could be really useful for preparing notes for the developers and handoff, because Cursor understands all of the context behind how the system works, so you can have it write you handoff notes. Key clarification also, again, I've said this already, but this code is not meant to go to production. And the value of this is just demonstrating your logic, testing complex design decisions that you can't test any other way, and really getting that alignment with stakeholders and developers about what you're building. For more on this topic, I really recommend my former colleague from SimilarWeb, Omer's presentation he gave at Startup Designers last month. I'll link it here. Really great, showing how in his work at SimilarWeb, they're using this method. Now, I'm not sure I've spoken about it on this channel before, but I'm currently building a startup with a friend. I'll share more as we're further along. Right now we're in semi-stealth mode. Basically, we're redesigning the dating app from the ground up to make an experience that's based on connecting people on the basis of personality rather than superficiality. It's not so important, the details of it at this exact moment, but my goal in using Cursor was to take a pretty well-developed design system that I had in Figma and bring that into Cursor such that I could prototype using it all across the app to a pixel perfect level. And eventually and because this is a startup, I actually have now taken charge of the majority of front-end work as a result of this. So this process is more complex and a bit messy. And so I'm going to talk a bit about how that went in my situation. So first, most designers, I think, know this, but just in case you don't, I'm going to go over it. So websites are made up of a combination of HTML and CSS. If you're trying to prototype in Cursor, is to just do it as an HTML and CSS based website, regardless of the technology that your actual product is using, just because it's very easy to work with. The code's pretty easy to understand. It's very easy to simulate it in your browser. And if your purpose is to just convey to the developers what you want them to build, it doesn't so much matter if you're working in the same coding language as them. So our goal in this method is building a CSS style sheet that has the majority of the info you need for your design system. So I started from a design system I had been working on for several years, building this product. We have kind of a funky aesthetic, and it's actually changed since I took these screenshots, but for reference, so this was the color palette that I was working with as it appeared in Figma files. I was able to simply take a screenshot of this and put this into Cursor and say, please add all of these colors as tokens to my main CSS file for this project. And it was able to do that. And so going step by step from that, in my case, in my design system, I had one Figma file for I'm kind of working based off of atomic design. So I had one Figma file for like the primitives, and then one Figma file for the composites. So one Figma file has things like colors and typography, and the other one has more complex components that rely on things like those colors and typography that I suggested. So I started from those very basic details, like the colors, like the fonts, and over time, you'd be able to put in the screenshots, and Cursor's able to read them and then translate that to code with very little work on my part. After repeating this process for things that you've established, other atoms in the design system, the typography, the spacing, it's easier then to teach it about your components because it already knows the basic pieces of your design system. So a lot of elements we needed to add in have changing states. So you need to clearly tell Cursor what design is for which state. And then to make it actually work in your product, you need to tell it to use something called native states. So for example, in Figma, let's say we make a hover state in Figma. We need to make a hover state as a variable in the component. We need to change the styling to make it reflect our design for the hover state. And then we need to go into the prototyping tab on Figma, and we need to make sure that it's set so that on hover, that component changes to the state that we've called hover. Got it? We've all been through that process working in Figma. To do the equivalent of that in code, what we need to do is to tell Cursor in the prompt, use this specific word, native states. So you want to tell it, like, if you say, this is the information for this design in the hover state, you want to say, use native states, like while you're asking it to add it to that CSS file that we talked about at the beginning. And so as you do that for each component, what I like to do is then ask it to create a test page for each of the components that I add so that I can check to make sure that the interactions are actually working based on that code. But the procedure is the same as what I showed before. You're going to add in screenshots. If they're labeled, that's even better. Another thing I've also done before is starting in Figma Make. So for example, I had 6 different states for the checkbox in my design system. So I made a frame that had all of the variants from the checkbox component in Figma. I pasted it, as you can see here, into Figma Make, and it gave me the code in HTML and CSS for those different checkboxes. And then I took it to Cursor, and then I tagged the CSS file in Cursor, and it was able to change the code so that it would fit the formatting that I already had on that page. And then I could also ask it to make a test sheet, as I showed before. This is the most precise method. In my case, I was working from a relatively small design system. It's not a complex systems project, and it's also, a pretty young app. I'm a solo designer on it. So while we had a decent amount of components, it wasn't a crazy number. This could be time consuming, and I really hope that the tools will make this easier in the future, because right now you do need to do some level of like the copying and pasting and manual work if you want to make sure it gets like really precise on the first try. So another way you can save some time is by copying the CSS code out of Figma Make itself more directly. So when you open a project in Figma Make, you do now have the option to use your design system. And this might be a way to bypass some of the steps that I showed you earlier. When you open a project in Figma Make, you can choose to prompt it with the design system as context. And what it'll do is it'll take all of the tokens that you have inside of your design system and put them inside a CSS file that's inside of the Figma Make. So if you switch from the preview to the code and then go to here, theme.css, you can actually copy out all of that information. So these are the colors and the fonts, the things I was speaking about earlier. You might be able to get it a bit faster into Cursor just by taking advantage of that integration that Figma Make already has, where it's pulling your design system and taking things into the code here. So after you do this for each of your components, you can have your entire design system in code. When you want to make a new project then, or you want to try out a new idea or prototype something using the design system, you can either in a new project just copy the CSS file if you're making like a new repository or file for each project, or you can just keep doing your work all inside of one repository. And if you do this really for every component in your design system, you can get pixel perfect. So it's quite powerful if you take in the time to invest to do this. So I've gone over how to do this for your own personal use. I want to give some guidelines if you want to take what you get from this tutorial and bring it into some front-end production as a designer. This approach of actually using this code is not going to be appropriate for everyone. If you're working at a more established company or in a product that requires higher levels of security or like really complex logic, it's probably not going to be appropriate for you. And working in Cursor for front-end code that you intend to deploy is a real mindset shift relative to what we're used to as designers, like with vibe coding more. Because when we're vibe coding, we're not really thinking about what the code looks like. We're not reading the code. We're not reviewing the code. The second that our code is going to go to production, we need to start thinking of this as AI-assisted development and trying to understand a bit more what we're going to ship. And you don't have to do this alone. You can ask the AI about things that you don't understand in the code, but you need to be willing to go over it with a fine-tooth comb. And frankly, that's not everyone's strong suit. Not everyone is interested in doing that. And I believe in the future of our profession is that this isn't going to be a skill that's necessary for everyone to have. It's important that everyone knows how to prompt AI to get results. But in terms of making sure that the code is ready to go to production, that's a job for a developer, not us as designers. So don't fear if you're not interested in this. So as I said, when designers contribute to the front end, you need to have this higher level of attention to the changes in the code and understanding of how the system is structured. And another really important thing is that you need to be communicating with your developers, because it's very easy when you're making these front end changes to not think about the implications for the back end. So I'll give you an example from something that I did recently. On the page when users log into the app that I'm developing, I wanted to make it so that the greeting on the page would change based on the time of day and the level of familiarity that the user had with the product. So if the users open the product 4 or 5 times, I want it to maybe say something different in the subtitle compared to someone who's opening it for the first time. So I thought, no big deal. I'm just going to ask Cursor to do that. And I wrote out what I wanted it to say in each of the different scenarios, and it implemented it and it worked. But what I didn't realize initially as a non-developer is that in order to do that, there needed to be changes to the database of the product that recorded all of this information, like how many times a user has visited the site, when their last visit was, what time of day it was for them. All of those things needed to be added to the database. And the database is the back end. This is where the data in the site is being stored. And when I made a change to the structure of the database, my developer got quite upset at me because he said, you did a lot of work on the front end, but you really need to check with me before you make changes to the database, because whatever changes we make, we're kind of stuck with them for the life of the product. So it needs to be thought through carefully. And so that's the kind of thing where, from my thought, I'm thinking, oh, like, it's not really such a big deal. I'm thinking of it as something that's having to do with the user experience, with the front end, but actually it has these very big implications for the product. So just having that open line of communication with developers is very, very important, and really taking the time to get a better understanding of what their work is like before you encroach in that space. So there are also some other ways of working between Cursor and Figma and your existing design system I want to talk about. So a lot of us in the industry use Storybook. I'm not currently working on a project that uses Storybook, so I haven't been able to experiment with this. This is a front-end dev tool that a lot of people use kind of as part of the broader design system. It's a code repository. It lets you simulate how elements work. It holds documentation. If your team has it, you should pull code from there and experiment. There's also the Figma MCP server. So an MCP is a model context protocol. It's a way of communicating better between Figma and AI. Personally, I don't use this very much because I was working from pretty loosely organized Figma files prior to moving into Cursor, and Cursor is where a lot of my design work is happening at the moment. But if you want to explore this more, definitely check out this Figma help article, because if you're willing to invest the time into building the design system in a way that works with the MCP server, it can be really powerful. I just saw a little bit before I started recording this video from Monday.com, where they talk about how they're generating code from their design system using a combination of Storybook and Figma MCP. So I definitely recommend giving it a watch if you want to know more about how to use these tools. I've only seen a little bit of it so far, but it seems really interesting. So in conclusion, there's so many ways to work with Cursor for product design. Huge spectrum from super low effort, just uploading screenshots and telling it what to do, versus like fully migrating your design system into code. Choose the approach that's best for your product's needs, that matches like where your team is at and what you're trying to accomplish in the moment. And I really hope that this helps give you a bit more orientation as you start to explore these tools. And I'd love to hear, what do you want to see next? You can message me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with other people who are working in this space and playing around with these tools and using them for real meaningful work. So thank you so much. This is Build with Katherine. If you enjoyed this video, love it if you could like and subscribe and leave a comment, would be also awesome. And yeah, until next time, bye.